You're not going to solve climate change by telling everyone, I'm sorry, could you be a little poorer? Could you freeze a little more and be a little less comfortable? Anything we do the next 5-10 years will have virtually no impact by 2050. 9 times more people die from cold than heat.
Welcome to another episode, Deep Dive, today with Dr. Bjørn Lomborg. Hi, Bjørn.
Hi, Mark.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well.
Yeah, where are you? In the jungle or where is it?
No, I'm actually in southern Sweden. So this is our home.
Beautiful.
I have lots of plants. I love plants.
Okay.
I'm looking into, we have like an orange, a winter garden, I think that's what they call it, where we keep all the plants that can't survive in the frost. So it's even more green that way, but slightly less nicely arranged. It's more sort of all stuffed in there.
Beautiful, beautiful. The next interview, we do it live in your house and we come to you. It looks much nicer than my background. Anyhow, I just figured out it's the first time you're on a German channel and I'm really honored having you because I actually following you for a long time and now your book, Klimapanik, got translated in German and published in the same publishing house than my best-selling book. So right now we are brothers in mind, you know. Just kidding. Now, and yeah, you have to introduce yourself to our audience because I think they would like to know who is it and why did Mark invite him? Why is he so exciting?
Who is that guy? Yes. So my name is Bjørn Lomborg. I'm actually an academic. I used to think I was just going to sort of teach statistics and game theory for the rest of my life and do papers that 3 people would read kind of thing. But I also find that it's incredibly important to have a conversation about, basically public intellectuals get paid for reading books that are fun to read. That's an amazing job. So I felt like you should pay back. You should actually make sure that some of the stuff that you find out get into the public conversation. One of those conversations was an American economist named Julian Simon, who said, everything you know about the environment is wrong. Actually, a lot of things are getting better, not worse. Say, take air pollution. Air pollution has come down dramatically. And, I'm an old Greenpeace kind of guy, not out in a rubber boat, but, I was a member and I had the posters on my wall and, the little badges on my backpack. I was really worried about the environment. And I thought that can't be true. But I thought it'd be fun to find out why he was wrong. So I actually assembled some of my best students, and we were going to pick his book apart. And it turns out that much of what he said was actually true. I mean, if you think about it, everywhere in the rich world, also in Germany, air pollution levels have come down dramatically. It was terrible back in the 1950s and even worse in 1900. Today, air is incredibly clean. We can still do more, but it's actually come down dramatically. So I made that point in the public sphere. I wrote 4 articles in a Danish newspaper. This was back in 1998. And I just thought, this will be fun. And then it just broke into all hell loose of a conversation where everybody got in. A lot of people were just like, that's not true. That's not right. Very, very emotionally strong, but very weak on data. And data is really what I try to trade in. I'm a statistician. I try to tell people you can't know anything about the world unless you actually have the data to prove it. So I was trying to say we need a data conversation on this. And everybody else was saying, no, I feel strongly in my heart this is how it is. And I think that's how I ended up in this conversation. So I wrote a book. It eventually became a book in English and in German and very many other places called The Skeptical Environmentalist. I think it was called Apocalypse No in German. But fundamentally, this book sort of took me off track from what I was actually expecting to do and got me into this whole conversation about we need better data if we're actually going to make good decisions. Because remember, if we focus on using our intuition, it's only as strong as what our intuition is. And typically our intuition comes from, these three other guys that we know and, the article that we read in a paper that actually sells to us to confirm our biases. So there's a good chance that we don't have a good sense of what's really important, what matters, and how we fix these things. That's my conversation. I think that's probably also why you think I'm somewhat interesting, at least.
Definitely. Yeah, and if you're interested right now in his books, I will definitely put a link beneath the video in the show notes, and you can just see the English versions or the German versions from Bjørn. So, you are also the president of the Copenhagen Consensus Center and visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at the famous Stanford University. So, you also wrote a book you already mentioned, Skeptical Grammar List. In German, it's called Apocalypse No. And now, right now, you wrote the newest book. It's called, in English, it's False Alarm, How Climate Change Panic Costs Us Trillions, Hurt the Poor, and Fails to Fix the Planet. Are you a Klimaskeptic, or sometimes in German they say Klimaleugner?
Yes, I heard that name. That's a terrible name.
It is horrible. It's horrible.
Look, I point out that I'm a social scientist. I'm simply accepting pretty much all what the natural scientists are telling us. The UN climate panel, the IPCC, is probably the best place to get information. You should also be warned, it's a very, very boring place to get information. The latest report, and they put these out every 5 or 7 years, it's about 4,000 pages long. Even I haven't read all of it. I've read quite a bit of it. I think very few people have actually read very much from the... They're absolutely right. Global warming is a real problem. It's man-made. It is something we should fix. What I try to say, and this is really the addition that I make, and again, remember, it's not because I'm particularly brilliant. This is the argument of the only guy who ever won the Nobel Prize in climate economics, namely William Nordhaus from Yale University in 2018. And what he basically points out, and pretty much all economists points out, is yes, climate is a real problem. It will have real costs. That's why we should be concerned about it. But remember, climate policy also has costs, will also be problematic. Given that we have to pay both costs, we both have to pay the cost of climate, but also the cost of climate policy, we need to make sure that we minimize the sum of those two. That's a very different conversation from the current one we have, where we're almost exclusively focusing on the problem with climate, but then running up huge costs in the climate policy area, and very likely actually ending up making the world worse off because we don't think about both of these issues. And again, this is not controversial at all in the academic climate economic environment. This is what got him the Nobel Prize. But for most other people, it feels like, no, you can't say that's sacrilegious. Again, we should go with our intuition. And what I try to do, and that's also what I do in the Copenhagen Consensus Center, is really constantly saying, look, you can't just talk about stuff you want. You also need to talk about what's the price tag on that policy that you want. And then you got to compare the two. And then, of course, also think about, are there other and smarter ways to achieve that? We don't have that conversation in climate. But to be honest, we don't really have that conversation in many other places. When we talk about what should we do in healthcare or in education, it's very often based on emotions rather than asking the very particular question, what does the data tell us is the best policies? That is, the policies that give most of what we want at the lowest possible cost. We don't have that conversation we should have. And that, I think, is why a lot of people don't like me, because I say, your favorite policy is actually not very effective. It doesn't mean you don't have a point. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do some of the stuff you talk about, but we should do it smarter and we should remember the context.
Yeah. So to summarize, actually, you're not denying climate change. You're just saying that we should be more rational about it. Is that correct?
Yes. I'm certainly not denying climate. I am arguing we need to be smart about which policies we choose, and that's rational.
Okay. So do you think we can handle climate change? You think we can change something like in the next 10, 5 or 15 years or till 2050 like the European Union wants to?
So I think most people have no clue what the natural scientists are telling us, what the UN climate panel is telling us. Anything we do the next 5, 10 years will have virtually no impact by 2050. This is just simply because the climate system is an incredibly large super tanker. So if you want to turn that, it's going to take a very, very long while. This is not rocket science. It's actually the science. And so anything you do now will really only have a major impact by the end of the century. We can do that, and I think we should have a conversation about how we do that. We should recognize that this is not the only problem, or possibly even the biggest problem of the world. And just to give you a sense of proportion here, the best models, both from William Nordhaus, the guy who won the Nobel Prize, but also pretty much all of the models, indicate that if we do nothing about climate, it will get costlier and costlier. That is, it'll have a lot of impacts. Some of them are on market economy, but most of them because we lose wetlands and we'll have stronger storms that'll hurt us more, all those kinds of impacts that you hear a lot of talk about. If you try to accumulate all those costs, not just the economic cost, but also the equivalent of the non-economic cost, the total cost by the end of the century will be equivalent to about 4% of global GDP by then. So we'll feel like we're 4% less well off than we otherwise would have been. That's definitely a problem. Now, remember, the UN also expect by the end of the century, the average person, these are the same models, expect that by the end of the century, because we'll be much better, much more efficient, we'll have much more trade, all those kinds of things, the average person on the planet will be about 450% as rich as he or she is today. So what this really means is climate will mean that instead of being 450% as rich as we are today, we will only be 434% as rich. Now, it's important to say that's still a problem, but it's not this end of the world that a lot of people are being told, that a lot of people believe. It's a problem, not the end of the world. And this matters because if people think climate change is the end of the world, and remember, this is not just a phrase of speaking. The latest survey across all OECD countries show that 6 of 10, so 60%, 59% of all people in the OECD area believe that it's likely that climate change will lead to the extinction of the human race. That's just ridiculously off. If you read the UN climate panel, there's no such thing in there. There's no such thing. This is simply not in the cards. Now, climate change will be a problem. It'll not be the end of the world. But if you think that this is the end of the world, then obviously you're willing to pay whatever it takes. If you think it's the end of the world, you're willing to say, why are you sitting and talking about money when it's the end of the world? I get that. But that's not the reality. It is a problem, not the end of the world. And so we should make sure we fix it in a way that doesn't actually create more problems.
Mm-hmm. You said nobody has a clue, but one group has a clue. It's the last generation. They have clue because they use the clue for putting themselves on the streets or in museums on beautiful pictures from Rembrandt and so on. Anyhow, do you think this climate change is it a money thing? Is there industry behind it? Because there's so much money got poured in from taxes and sponsors and everything. So what do you think? Is it an industry, a new one?
So there's a confluence of a lot of different things. I'm not very big on conspiracy theories. I don't think, when I debate with most of these people from Al Gore, I have never met Greta Thunberg, but my impression of her is she's a really well-meaning woman, who actually wants to do good. Most of these people want to do good. Now, given that there's a lot of money, as you point out, about $1 trillion we're spending on renewable energy that we wouldn't have spent had we not had this conversation. It's obvious that a lot of these companies will be saying, yeah, you should probably be worried, buy more of my windmills, right? I mean, I don't know, when we had the big climate summit in Copenhagen in 2009, all of the subway stations, all of them were plastered with Vestas, our wind turbine producer, one of the biggest in the world, saying you need a good agreement. And of course we need a good agreement, but it would also be good for Vestas to having a good agreement. But again, I think it's true that Vestas will probably be pushing a little bit more climate alarmism, just like Exxon or some of these other oil companies will be saying, you shouldn't actually be all that worried. I think it's much more a different kind of problem here. Why is it that we always have bad news? Well, it's because bad news sells. You tell people that bad news is bad for you, and most people get that. And then when you ask them, so here's a pile of bad news, here's a pile of good news, what would you prefer to read? Most people say they want to read the good news. But then when you do the experiment, it turns out that most people peek in and actually end up reading most of the bad news because it's more fun. And so the reality is that most of what we hear in the news are bad news. You never hear that your school is working well. You hear that the school is failing and the kids don't learn anything and the teachers are terrible or the hospital system is not working. And likewise, you hear with the climate system that we're all going to die. It's much more fun to read, but it's obviously not very good if we're actually going to make good decisions. There we need the truth, if you will. And I think we're very, very badly prepared to understand what this problem is. Most people think that we're all going to die from climate-related disasters, but the reality is, and you should actually, if you want to, you should link to this because we have good data for that. We have good data back from for about 100 years ago, so from 1920s, we've good data for how many people died from climate-related disasters. So floods, droughts, storms, wildfires, and extreme temperatures. If you map that out, it turns out in the 1920s, on average, about 500,000 people died every year from this. Most people would then think, oh, but because of climate change, it's gone up. No, it's declined dramatically, so that last year in 2022, about 11,000 people died. So 98% fewer people died, despite the fact that we're 4 times more people on the planet. Why is that? It's because we're richer, we have better technology, we know how to avoid these things. People don't die in the millions anymore. People die in the hundreds or perhaps even in the tens. And that's a wonderful thing. But we need to know these things. The main reason why climate change is a problem is not because lots and lots of people are going to die, because they don't. That's not what the data shows us. It's because when temperatures rise, every city, everywhere in the world is slightly ill-suited for the new temperature, right? So Frankfurt is, it's colder than what Munich, but they're both well adapted to their temperatures. So when the temperatures move up a little bit, both of them will need a little more air conditioning and a little less insulation. That's going to be costly. That's where much of the 4% cost comes from. It's not from these dramatic storms that we see that are actually getting less and less deadly. It's from these banal things that we don't talk about, but actually are much, much more important if we're going to talk about how do we fix this problem and how do we adapt to it well.
Yeah. We had, for example, in the past, we had the Club of Rome. In Germany, in the 80s, we had acid rain. They actually predicted that in 20 years, till the year 2000, we will have no forests anymore. And then we had, of course, Al Gore, the fearmonger, with his Oscar-winning documentation, The Inconvenient Truth. So, and he said, I think the poles will melt and Amsterdam will be gone and everything. Nothing happened. So why should it this time happen? Why do they think that they're now much better than in the past? So
the important thing. Yeah, the important thing to remember is all of these were vastly exaggerated, right? Surveys showed back then that more than half of all Germans actually believed that all forest would be gone by 2000, because that was what the media told us. So I get that. Now, remember, there was a problem. Acid rain actually did have negative impacts. Yeah, acid rain is a real thing. It's mostly an air pollution problem. It had some problems, especially in Sweden and Norway, with lakes that were getting more acidic and hence would support less animal life. So if you will, and I'm just making this in a very sort of hand-waving kind of way, 1% of the story was true. And so it was good we did something about it. Actually, it turns out that the main thing we did about acid rain was cut back on NOxes and SOxes, basically the standard air pollution. We did it because of acid rain. But the real good impact was that it made the air cleaner. So the air that we breathe in, that was one of the first things we started with, right? Air pollution is down dramatically. And that turns out to be incredibly important because lots and lots of people die from air pollution. So it turns out we were vastly exaggerated, but there was a real problem. Likewise, with the ozone layer, it was a problem. And it was good. We found a fairly cheap and simple solution. That's good. That's how you deal with these problems. You find a technological solution, you fix it, you move on. The Club of Rome was probably a little different because the Club of Rome was also telling us everything is going to go to hell and we're all going to collapse. And I think, if anything, it just simply shows those kinds of stories typically not true. There's a reason why advanced economies don't actually collapse, because one of the reasons that you had lots of hunger in the past was because if you're hungry here in this region, you have no way of moving food in from 200 kilometers away where they have lots of food. We do have that today, and that's why an interrelated world basically don't see any hunger unless it's because people are poor. So we need to recognize there's a lot of fear. We're poorly informed in many of these things, but there's a kernel of truth. And so the point that I want to emphasize is, we shouldn't just say, oh, there is nothing to acid rain, so let's just throw out climate change as well. There is something to it, but let's stop having this exaggerated, unnecessary conversation, and let's start having the real conversation about, here's a problem. How do we fix it smartly without actually ending up paying even more than the problem it cost in the first place?
Yeah, I'm very optimistic actually about mankind and as well capitalism, because there was always a solution, innovation or something if there is a problem and we face it. So that's why I don't believe in Verbote. What is an English word? Was ist das englische Wort für Verbote? To forbid something. Yeah,
yes.
I believe in creation and creativity of mankind. So we founded a catalysator in the cars, and we made the chimneys cleaner actually, and everything. So
Mark, can I just, before you go on, because I think that's a very, very important point. And if you look, for instance, in the 1860s, the world was hunting whales to extinction across the world. Why? Because whales have this wonderful thing inside of them that's incredibly clean burning oil. And so basically what lit up most of Western Europe and North America in the 1850s was whale oil. And your point is exactly, the way to save the whales was not to tell everyone, I'm sorry, could you stop burning all that your nice burning stuff? Could you turn down the lamp and go back to these very polluting lamps that are more fire hazard and don't burn as cleanly and will stain your ceilings and all that stuff? People were not going to accept that. What did work was that we found oil. Right? We found oil in the ground, first in Pennsylvania and then many other places, and it's much, much easier to get that oil out of the ground than it is to go out in the middle of the ocean to kill a whale. Exactly. And so in many ways you can argue, this is not the whole story, but you can certainly argue that a large part of the reason why we saved the whales was because we had technological innovation. So again, you're not going to solve climate change by telling everyone, I'm sorry, could you be a little poorer? Could you freeze a little more and be a little less comfortable? Is that okay with you? Most people are going to say a tiny bit maybe, but I'm not actually going to do all the things that you want me to do. The only way we're going to fix climate change is through innovation. Now, I would like to caution a little bit, because you say, I believe in capitalism. I believe that we are going to fix all of this. I think it's relevant to say that some people would worry to say, sure, we've come up with a lot of good solutions, but what if we don't have a good solution to climate change? And that's a real issue. We should be concerned about the fact that just because we've fixed everything in the past doesn't mean that we'll necessarily fix the next problem. But I think we got to face up to the music of saying, if you want to fix something, innovation is the way to go. If you're worried that we're not going fast enough, you should be spending a lot more money on that innovation. But then we should also recognize there is a chance that we will just not find a better solution than fossil fuels. And if we don't do that, then of course, especially China, India, Africa is just going to keep on using fossil fuels. That will be a problem. But then, again, remember, it's a 4% problem. It's not the end of the world. And that's why we need to recognize we've solved a lot of problems across the world, but we haven't solved all problems. And we're actually okay as a civilization if we fixed most problems, not all problems. And that's why we need to say we should fix climate change. We should fix it smartly and realistically through innovation. And then we should also say, if you're worried that we're not innovating fast enough, you should be spending a lot more on that.
Yeah. I definitely agree with you right there. And we had this demonstration in Lützerath because there was a coal project which they created, and there were a lot of protests going on. And just before our interview, I was doing some research, and actually I got the same figures than in your book, because 39% were saying they are hesitant about getting children because of the potential climate crisis. So perhaps the problem is solving itself, actually, because we die out or something. Yeah, people are really scared, and you feel there are fearmongers, and there's propaganda, and there are billions and billions of taxpayers' money getting into subvention into new projects and subsidize other things. So the first of all, who is the science? And secondly, is the science actually right, or are misused from, I don't know, industries, companies, lobbyists?
So I think a lot of this stems from the fact that, again, media loves bad news. And so media has constantly been pulling out these stories of saying, for instance, take a look at what happens when sea levels rise. So we know sea levels are rising. We know that a very large part of this is because of global warming. So as we get warmer temperatures, especially water, just like everything else, will expand. And that's why you see rising sea levels. You'll also have, first of all, glaciers on the land masses melting, and eventually also some of Greenland and Antarctica. And that's why we're predicting that in the worst case scenario, you could actually end up seeing about a meter of sea level rise towards the end of the century. That's not a trivial issue. But again, we also need to have a sense of proportion. So the Washington Post, New York Times, many others have been publishing this story that if you just look at what does a meter, I can't actually show that here, but what does a meter mean? If you look at how many people live within a meter of the sea, turns out that answer is about 187 million people. So the simple research will tell you if we do nothing, then 187 million people will have to move. Now, that became the headline story in Washington Post, in New York Times, and I'm sure in many German papers as well, because it basically says half of Western Europe, or that number of people, will have to move because of global warming. Or, in Rolling Stone magazine, it then became 187 million people are going to drown. Now, that's just ridiculous, right? I mean, you're not going to drown because water slowly creeps up over the next 80 years. But what it is important to say is the very research that found this also says it is incredibly unlikely that we would not do anything. That's not what we've done in the past. We actually know how to deal with these things. Remember Holland? Holland has actually protected itself from much more sea level rise, and it's actually brought back about 40% of its land area from the sea. The total cost of all of Holland's protection up to now is about 10 billion euros. That's not nothing, but over 50 years for a pretty rich economy, it's virtually nothing. Of course, we're all going to protect ourselves. So the very same research that says 187 million people will need some sort of protection also shows that almost all of these people will be protected. And what that will cost is a tiny, trivial part of what it would cost if we didn't do that. So it'll cost about $30-40 billion a year globally to satisfy this by the end of the century. That, again, that's not nothing, but it's a very, very small fraction of the 4% that I was talking about earlier on. And what that tells you is the right story turns out to be, instead of 187 million people will be flooded, that 15,000 people will be flooded every year. you're just sort of struggling with the fact that most of our media is telling us something that is just simply not true. It's true in the very technical sense if we did nothing, but that's very, very wrong. Now, what happens is when you only see that story, and when that's the only story that gets promoted, partly because it sells papers, but also because it's now become almost a religion that you have to say the worst number that you could find in whatever scientific paper is there, then you get all these kids and adults alike who are scared witless. Look, if I heard constantly one story after another telling us we're doomed, this is going to go badly, there's no way we're going to be able to feed the world, all these kinds of stories, I can understand why you'd end up, thinking like Greta Thunberg and saying, we got to, stop everything. Because that's a rational argument. If global warming is a meteor hurtling towards Earth and it'll kill everything when it hits, then obviously that's the only thing we should be focusing on. But the reality is, global warming is a middling problem among many other problems that we need to fix over this century. And our preoccupation with this one thing means that partly we do it really badly, which, I'm sorry to say, Germany has been a leading contender in showing how not to deal with this. But also, we end up ignoring a lot of the other issues, much, I think, to our own disbenefit. So the reality here is we need to fix climate change along with many others, but we need to fix it smartly. And then, of course, we also need to lift out people from this depression of a climate change end of the world sort of sets, because it's not just an economic cost. It means, I understand those kids who say, if my life is going to be forfeit in 20 or 30 years, why should I bother study? Why should I even bother doing anything? You should bother studying because those are the things that are going to fix not just climate change, but also fix hunger and fix malaria and fix all the other problems in the world that we don't talk about right now, but we should.
Yeah, definitely. Before I ask you what we can do, what are the solutions, I would like to know from you, man-made climate change, how much is it? 100%, or is there also some natural behind it? What's the percentage? Is it 100%, 50%, 5%?
So the UN climate panel used to say that it's somewhere between 50 and 100%. They've gone very strongly in to say it's close to 100% now. I find that a little hard to believe, but again, I'm not a natural scientist, so I would tend to go with it's certainly the larger part of it. But I also think, in some sense, the point here is not to say that just exactly how much of this is our fault. It's much more of saying, how are we going to tackle this in the future? So again, to look at the data, when people think about higher temperatures in the future, they think about all these storms and all these terrible things that are going to happen. As we just talked about, that's actually wrong. Fewer and fewer people are dying. If you look at the number of hurricanes, the number of strong hurricanes, the energy in hurricanes, we have good data back to 1980, which is the first time where we have satellites. It's actually slightly declining on pretty much all of these indicators. Last year, the year before, was some of the lowest ones we've ever had. We need to get a sense of reality check. You can't just say, oh, here's a hurricane, so global warming is going to kill us all. No, that was a hurricane. There was hurricanes in the past. Yes, in the long run, we expect hurricanes to become perhaps slightly fewer, but slightly stronger. We can't tell that. We can actually show that we probably won't be able to show that statistically before in the 2050s or 60s. But yes, it is a problem. But it's not the problem that you think. It's not this end all that you see in the media, and it makes you become very bad at dealing with the problem. Let me just give you one other example, which I think surprises a lot of people. So when you talk about more heat, higher temperatures, you immediately think about more heat waves and more people are going to die from heat. We actually have good data for this. So the Lancet did this global study. There's been lots of others before that, but it's the best study of global impact on heat temperatures. What they found was about 500,000 people die from too high temperatures every year around the world. That's certainly an issue. And because of global warming, that will go up unless, of course, we fix it with, for instance, air conditioning, which we probably to a very large extent will do. But it's still a concern. What most people don't realize is the number of people dying from cold is much, much larger. So it's about 4.5 million people that die globally, or about 10% of everyone who dies on the planet. So 9 times more people die from cold than heat. When you think about it, it's not really rocket science, because heat is fairly simple to deal with, whereas cold, the reason why it kills you is because it makes you, if you're not warm enough, your blood vessels constrict to keep your inner body core working. That drives up your blood pressure, and we know blood pressure is correlated, for instance, with heart attacks and strokes and so on. And so what happens here is we focus so much on extra heat, which is actually fairly cheap and preventable, but we focus very little on the fact that if we make if we make energy more costly, which is often what we do with climate policy, we actually leave a lot more people vulnerable to cold around the world. And we're seeing that this winter because of the war in Ukraine and everything else. Energy prices have been incredibly high. People have had to heat their homes much less. The economists estimate that means that on top of the 400,000 people who die every year in Europe because of cold, it will probably mean somewhere between 70 and 170,000 more people that will die because of cold. Why don't we have that conversation? Because it's politically incorrect. Again, this does not deny the fact that global warming is a real problem. But it does mean we need to have a broader conversation where we actually allow these kinds of conversations to take place.
Yeah. There are skeptics and critics who say we actually seeing it's getting colder at the world in the last couple of years, and there are also like conspiracy theorists who say nothing will happen. And I'm searching for the truth actually, because I definitely believe that there is a change, that we see evolutionary process, and climate is always changing for billion of years right now. And I think, of course, we have some impact on the climate change, but is it 1% or is it 100%? And I'm pretty sure we won't change it tomorrow or in the next 50 years. And if I see Greta Thunberg or Luisa Neubauer from Germany, and they're all fear-mongering and doing the propaganda and say, 2030 we're all gonna die, or till 2050. I know if we look back in the future, we will say, hey, nothing happened or little happened, and it got actually better or worse or whatever. So I think it's a very important topic, because I think it will misused against the citizens of the world. We have to pay more taxes, perhaps even digital money and more digital dictatorship or whatever, and we all get a CO2 account and just allowed to travel once a month with a plane or with a car or something like that. So it smells like socialism for me. Perhaps I'm too negative or too pessimistic. Perhaps I'm too realistic. But something smells.
Mark, let me just so on the idea that we're seeing declining temperatures just now, I think it's very dangerous. So we are seeing declining temperatures, but mostly because it hit a new spike in 2018. So again, I think the general trend is upwards. And you're absolutely right. Climate has always changed. And if you look back sort of 70 million years, it was a lot warmer on the planet. But an economist's answer would be to sort of say, yeah, but that's not really relevant in a human sort of time scale. What matters to us is a century, or fundamentally the time that it's taken for us to build our current infrastructure, because that's really what needs to change. So 100, 200 years is what really matters. And there it certainly has gotten warmer, partly probably because we came out of a little ice age, but certainly also because we're increasing temperatures. And so it's relevant to have that conversation. I think you're right in saying that there's a lot of these sort of dictatorship models. So Deutsche Bank actually said, if we are going to get these sorts of solutions that people are suggesting, these sort of net zero, we need to start talking about, will it be necessary to have a dictatorship? And I think they were sort of, slightly saying it in tongue in cheek, because what it really shows you is you're never going to succeed to pay that much money for that long in a democracy. You can have politicians who come and say, I'm going to save you from climate change. But when it turns out it's going to cost you many thousands of euros every year, people start saying, no, I'm going to vote for that other guy. And so that's, I think, what happens in democracies, and that's probably a good thing. What that means is, again, you can't solve global warming by telling people you can't do this. You have to be poor. You have to be colder. You can solve it through innovation, just like we did with the whales. It's not about telling, don't kill the whales, because that's never going to work. Burn more uncomfortable fuels. The solution has to be technological. If we can get, say, fourth generation nuclear power to be cheaper than fossil fuels, everyone will switch. And remember, not just rich, well-meaning Germans, but also the Chinese, the Indians, and the Africans. And so, again, it comes back to realizing...
And they are the key, actually, Bjørn. They are the key.
Absolutely.
Because they want to succeed.
Us.
They want to get richer. They want to drive a car. They want to have a house and everything. They want to travel.
Of course. And I think most people forget that, the rich world make up about a third of all emissions right now, and over the century, about a fourth. And honestly, even if we go net zero and all that stuff, it's only going to have a slight impact unless we manage to get everybody else with it. And we're not going to manage to get everyone else with us by saying, see, we got incredibly poor and it's really uncomfortable, but please do the same thing as what we're doing.
Nobody will follow.
People are not going to buy into that. Yeah. And as you point out, especially in India and Africa, where they really want to get out of poverty, that's a much more important issue. And so we need to get realistic about this. We need to find a way to say, don't you want to have the same incredibly cheap, effective, clean, hopefully, green energy rather than your old dirty fossil fuel? But that requires us to have much cheaper technologies, and we don't today. People love to say, oh, solar and wind is the cheapest forms of energy. Sure, they are when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing, but when it's not, it's actually the most costly of all of them because you can't buy it for money. And people think, they have no sense of size. They think, oh, but batteries. No, batteries right now, we have enough batteries to support the world for 1 minute and 15 seconds. By the end of the century, by the end of the decade, we'll have built a lot more batteries, so we'll actually be able to support the world for a full 11 minutes. No, you need about 7,000 minutes when you have the Dunkelflaute. I hope I'm pronouncing that right in German, right? So reality is much harder than most green campaigners want to admit, and I think that's why we need to say this is all about innovation, not about telling people to do without.
Yeah, and you forgot to mention all the commodities, all the real materials, the nickel, the copper we get out of the earth, and you need a caterpillar for that, and they use like 250 liters of diesel an hour. So you won't drive a caterpillar with a lithium battery. So that's a totally different topic. But you recently published an article in the German newspaper Die Welt, one of the largest newspapers here in Germany, actually, together with Jordan Peterson. And I will put the link to the article down below in the show notes for you guys so you can have a check. And if you like the interview already, please subscribe, of course, and check out all the links from Bjørn. You have to follow him on Twitter and so on. So in the article, you argued actually that we try to do everything at once. Like we go there and there and there and there, and at the end we achieve nothing actually because we have no focus, we have no goal, and we are like a hen in the stable and don't know where to start something. So why is it not good to try to solve multiple problems at the same time? And what should we focus on instead, in your opinion?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right, and thanks a lot for having read the article. The main point is really that if you look at what the global community has decided, they have decided something called the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a collection of 169 targets. That's all there by itself sort of gives it away. We've just decided to make everything a priority. And of course, if everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. And so if you ask people, what should we do? They say, we should fix climate change, as we've just talked about. You should fix war. You should fix hunger. You should fix poverty. You should fix clean drinking water and sanitation and malaria and tuberculosis. And you have an endless list of all these things that you should be doing. Now, we've signed up to this. Germany has signed up. Everyone in the world. It's, I believe, only Syria that hasn't signed this yet. So fundamentally, every nation on the planet has promised to do everything. Now, if you look at most of the conversation, and it's also reflected in our conversation here, most people just talk about climate change. Most rich people really just care about climate change. We don't care all that much about tuberculosis because we don't get tuberculosis anymore. Remember, 100 years ago, almost everyone died from tuberculosis, but we fixed it. So it's not really on our agenda anymore. It still kills 1.5 million people every year. It's the biggest disease. It actually killed more last year than COVID did. But, we don't think about it anymore. We tend to believe that the biggest problem is climate. But in reality, of course, we also know, and if you sort of introspect a little bit, that war is a pretty big thing as well, right? With the Ukraine war and everything. And we also know that poverty really should be something we deal with, and hunger and all these other things. So the reality is we're trying to say we should fix all of these things. But by saying we should fix everything, we end up fixing very, very little. Not just in climate, where we're really not getting anywhere. We're still seeing increasing levels of CO2 emissions, and on all these other areas. So what we're trying to do, and that goes back to what we said at the very beginning, I run a think tank called the Copenhagen Consensus, where we work with lots of economists, lots of Nobels as well, to try to find out, look, where can you spend a euro or a dollar or a shilling or a rupee or whatever your currency is, and do the very most good first? So this is really about, again, saying we're not going to fix all problems by 2030. That would be wonderful if we did, but we're not. Where can we then spend our extra euro and do the most good first? It's sort of an obvious question. It turns out that it's not on climate. If you spend a sort of euro on the standard Paris Agreement kind of thing, you'll end up avoiding climate damage in the world, about 10 cents of climate damage. Now, that's nice. That's pretty good. But, you could have given away the euro and made people 10 times happy. You could just have given it to poor people, and the world would have been 10 times better off. So you probably didn't do all that well. But it turns out that there's a lot of other things that you can do that'll, do sort of okay. What we've tried to do is to say, what are some of the things that'll do the very most good? We've arbitrarily said, what are the things that for every euro you spend will do at least 15 euros of social good in the world? So really, really a lot of good. We've identified 12 things together with some of the world's best economists. 12 things where we, for very little money, could do an amazing amount of impact. So let me just give you a couple of examples. So for tuberculosis, for instance, as I mentioned, 1.5 million people die each year. We know how to fix this. We've actually known for 50 years, but we just haven't really cared. If we focused on getting more people diagnosed and treated for tuberculosis, that's the reason why it keeps coming back, because we only diagnose about 60% of everyone who has tuberculosis. We could basically get rid of almost all tuberculosis for about 5 billion, and sorry, I'm going to say dollars because that's the way you count this, right? So a little less than euros. So $5 billion a year. That's not nothing, but it's not a whole lot of money to save 1.2 million lives every year. How amazing would that be? Same thing for malaria. Malaria is still about 600,000 people, and we know how to get rid of a very large part of this with getting out more bed nets. If we did that, we could, for very little money, so we're talking about $4 billion over the next 8 years, and we could save about 4 million people. How amazing, again, would that be? Why are we not doing these kinds of things? If you look at schooling, so we all know that there's problems in our schools and in the rich world, but it's nothing compared to what it is in most poor countries. One of the reasons why poor countries are poor is because they have really bad schools. Now, we've spent the last 50 years or so trying to get kids into schools, and that was good. It's much better that a kid is in school than they're not in school. But they learn very, very little. So about 500 million kids. Remember, there's about 750 million kids in school, in primary school across the world. So about 2/3 of them, so 500 million kids, learn virtually nothing. Here's one example of the question that they get. So a 10-year-old will have to read this sentence, right? VJ has a red hat, a blue shirt, and yellow socks. What color is the hat? Now, it's the right answer here is red, right? But unfortunately, 80% can't answer that question. So we've technically learned them to read. They can read the individual words, but they can't string it together into a meaning. Now, you're not going to get rich. You're not going to get out of poverty if you don't know how to do this. And this is to a very large extent because these schools are really, really bad. Turns out that there are some amazingly effective ways to deal with this. There's also some really, really bad ways to deal with it, like, for instance, giving teachers much more pay or building a lot more schools, both of which Indonesia actually did in the early 2000s. And what happens is if you give teachers much more pay, they'll become much happier, we know that, but it doesn't actually change learning. If you build a lot more schools, it's easier to go to school, but it doesn't teach you anything more. What does work, and it's fortunately much, much cheaper, is either structured teacher plans. So, the teachers are really poor themselves. If you help them by coaching them, by giving them plans, also sending them text messages, you don't actually do this, right? But you send it out via computer so that they get this week you should go through this. And in this sequence, you can make the teachers teach much better. That's incredibly cheap. It's well documented, and it would actually get each of these kids to learn about 2 years for every 1 year they go to school. How cool is that? Imagine if you get them on a tablet. So one of the big problems in schools today is that you have a situation where you teach all the 12-year-olds in the same grade, but some of these kids have no idea what's going on. Some of these kids are bored out of their brains, and then there's a few that actually sort of stick with the teacher. Imagine if you could teach each of them at their own level. You can do that with a tablet. You put them in front of a tablet 1 hour a day, and then that tablet will very quickly figure out, all right, you're one of the smart kids, or you have no clue what's going on here, right? And then help them at their exact level. We know from lots of studies that this would be fairly cheap. So we're talking about $25 per kid because they'd be sharing this tablet with many others. And you also need solar panels to recharge it and all that stuff. But you could, doing that, you could get them 3 years of learning for every 1 year they're in school. So the point that we make is if you spent $1 here or €1 here, you could do 65 euros of good. Again, isn't that amazing? And so the whole point that we try to say is stop promising everything. These 12 ideas, they won't solve everything, but they will solve some incredibly important things about teaching kids. They'll get better land tenure. They'll get more e-procurement, all these other things, a lot of things that we've never heard of, but are all proven and shown to work. In total, it'll cost about $30 billion. That's not nothing. But compare that to the $1 trillion we're spending on clean energy. Just compare it to the fact that every year the world spends about $100 billion on cosmetics. I don't know. It seems like $30 billion, we could probably scrape that up somewhere. And that would generate so many benefits. We could save 4.2 million lives every year and make the poorest half of this world about $1 trillion better off every year. That's about 1/10 of their economy. So my point is not to say we can solve all things. My point is not that we can somehow magically make the world just, bling, and then everything is good. But we can focus on really smart individual things. And the reason we can do that is because we never talk about these boring things. So in some sense, we think of ourselves as the defenders of boring problems, the stuff that you haven't heard of, the stuff that we didn't do this podcast. I'm very happy that you allow me to speak on this, right? Because, the interesting topic is climate change. But the place where we could actually spend our money and help the world immensely is on these somewhat boring problems, but just happens to be incredibly effective. So I'm simply pushing, let's do the smart stuff first.
Yeah, definitely. Low-hanging fruits, actually. And the return on investment is much bigger, much greater impact than anything else. And you really help the people. And we would make the earth a better place, actually. Okay. And in your book, you wrote a whole chapter on things we should not do. May you describe 1 or 2 examples?
Sorry, so you have to remind me, because I can't actually remember that. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. You wrote something, things we should not do if we want to mitigate climate change.
Right. Yes. So for instance, when people talk about, there's very few things that we absolutely shouldn't do. Most of them are just incredibly ineffective of the kinds of things that we're doing. So for instance, take the fascination with electric cars. So everybody loves to love electric cars. But the reality is a car will emit about, say, 35 tons of CO2 over its lifetime if you run it on gas or diesel. And an electric car will still emit a very, very large portion of that, partly because all of the production takes about the same amount of emissions. The battery production takes more. Most of the batteries still come from China, where they're basically made with coal. And then much of the electricity that we feed into the cars are still somewhat fossil fuel based. Not, for instance, in Norway, but certainly in Germany and elsewhere. So the net reduction is about 10, 15 tons of CO2. Now, that's not nothing. That's about a third or thereabouts. That's nice. That'll do a little bit to fix climate change. But look at what we're paying people to do, because most people actually don't want an electric car unless we bribe them. So typically the bribe in the US is what, $7,500. In Germany, I think it's 10,000 euros, isn't it? Or, yeah, it used to be, at least a year ago when I checked, sorry. But we spent an enormous amount of money to basically save 10 to 15 tons. Remember, we could have done that on the European trading emission system for about 1,000 euros. We're paying 10 times as much to reduce our emissions a little bit. That's a stupid strategy. Now, we should definitely be working to get better and more effective electric cars. If you've ever driven a Tesla, it's a fun car to drive. It's also a very, very expensive car to drive, right? But if you can afford it, and it fits for some people, if you only drive, like 40 or 50 kilometers to work and you can charge it there and go back, that kind of thing, that's wonderful. A lot of people also want to be able to go, the long haul, and then suddenly electric cars are a lot less of an advantageous opportunity. So again, electric cars is going to be a smaller part of the solution. So I find this hilarious. The Biden administration actually came out with an estimate of how many electric cars will we have. Remember, we have about 1% electric cars globally today. How many electric cars will we have by mid-century? Everybody sort of suggests, we'll be almost saturated. It'll almost be 100%. But the answer by the Biden administration was about a third of all cars by then will be electric, because we've spent an enormous amount of money bribing people, but most people actually don't want an electric car, and many places can't afford it and obviously don't have the electric capacity to deal with it either, because you need to upgrade a lot. So the fundamental point is, let's not focus and push for a lot of these sexy, interesting, but incredibly costly solutions that'll do almost nothing. What we should be doing instead is spend much less money, but much more smartly on innovation. If we could innovate the next green energy to be cheaper than fossil fuels, we'll have solved the problem. That's what we don't talk about right now. But it's much more fun to go down those lines of saying, no, let's put up lots of solar panels or wind turbines or electric cars, rather than saying this is all about innovation, because innovation is what's going to be possible to get India and China and Africa on board.
Yeah. I like renewable energy, but in the end, we need reliable energy, because if there is a Dunkelflaute, if there's no sun, no wind, we need energy. And I think we will stick with fossil energies for a long time. And we saw it last year. We had increasing energy prices all over Europe, not only because of the war in Ukraine. And there were also some problems because of the supply chains and prices and everything, and more investment in fields and so on. So especially natural gas went up parabolic. So one of the arguments of politicians is to fight climate change to help actually the poor. Is that true?
So the poor is going to be most harmed by climate change. A lot of people make that argument. And therefore they say, so they have been the least responsible. This is why we should do something about climate change. But of course, the point to remember is the poor are most vulnerable to everything. They're the most vulnerable to, climate, yes, but also to disease, to economic trajectories, to the cost of food, to everything else. And so the reality is, again, if you want to help poor people, you should get them out of poverty. It's not really rocket science. I'm always astounded by the way that people sort of suggest. So if you remember, Tacloban in the Philippines were hit by a strong Category 5 hurricane back in 2013. It happened right while the UN was meeting in a climate summit. So everybody made this about climate. Actually, a very, very similar Category 5 hurricane hit Tacloban exactly the same way about 100 years ago. And there, in 2013, it killed about 5,000 people, which is terrible. Back then, it killed about half the city. So many, many more. It was a much smaller city, but probably, on the order of, I think, 100,000 people or thereabout. So many, many more because they were poor. Now, people are then suggesting that if we do something about climate change, hurricanes might actually not become quite as much stronger than they otherwise would be. So we're basically saying, you know what? We're going to help you guys, not very effectively, but in 100 years, the hurricanes that are going to hit you are going to be slightly less, much stronger. That's a terrible way to help them. If you actually want to help them, get them out of poverty. They're incredibly vulnerable because they live in poverty, because they live under corrugated roofs. And when the hurricane hits, even a much less strong hurricane hits, they'll be wiped out. The point here is, we need to help people with the vulnerabilities they have today, and that's mostly vulnerability to poverty, get them out of poverty, but also education, as we talked about, disease, make sure that they have better food, all those kinds of things. And that is going to make them much better on a lot of other parameters. I mean, fundamentally, it's great not to die, but it'll also make them much more safe against climate change. Oh, and it will also mean that once you get sufficiently rich, you stop cutting down forest, you stop burning a lot of wood inside your house, you reduce air pollution, which is the worst killer in sort of environmental terms, and eventually you also start saying, you know what, I'd like a wind turbine. So the point here is, that's the only way that you're going to get most poor people out. So there's a tiny bit of truth, and it goes back to what we talked about before with acid rain and many others. There is a truth to this. But we're failing to see what is the implication of what we're actually trying to say. So I'm seeing a lot of really goodwill people on the green movement saying, I care a lot about the poor. And you know what? So I'm going to spend a lot of money on almost not helping them, but at least it'll only be far into the future. And I'm saying, well, if you actually cared about the poor, maybe we should listen to what they say themselves. They want us to do something about their poverty, their education, their circumstances, make sure that we actually get them food, make sure their kids don't die from easily curable infectious diseases tomorrow. That's the kind of thing that we should be focusing on first. That will also help in so many other ways, and it will make them much more robust against climate change.
Definitely. And affordable energy, of course, and electricity. It's very important and goes hand in hand with prosperity and education. So what do you think? How will be the energy mix for the future? Will we rely on fossil fuels, coal, gas, oil? Will there be nuclear power, renewables? So what do you think? How long will we have to stick with the dirty energy mix?
So if I knew the answer to that, I would be a lot richer than I am. So I think fundamentally it's really, really hard to say what the future will bring. But I think there's an important part of points. So you can take from the International Energy Agency, which is the one that we all go to, they show by mid-century the majority of energy will still come from fossil fuels. Fundamentally, we have no sense of how hard it is to get off. Václav Smil, who's a great, formerly Czech researcher. He lives in Canada. He's a retired professor there. He's apparently Bill Gates' favorite author of all time. He writes some amazing books. They're very geeky books. But he does a lot on the energy system. And his basic point is, we have no sense of how long these transitions take. When you had coal, when you had gas, when you had oil, that were actually incredibly effective. People wanted to buy them, and it still took half to a full century for them to take over. Imagine when we're then trying to say, would you like some energy sources like solar and wind that are not effective, that you don't actually want to buy unless we push you to do it? They're not going to take over. They're not going to take over anytime soon. And even if they take over in the rich world because we mandate it, and I can sort of see that, for instance, in the EU, because we're on this trajectory where the EU has just decided, no, climate change is more important than many other things, so we're just simply going to go green and pay up the cost, and we'll deindustrialize to the extent that it's necessary. I could see that outcome happening, but what really that means is we're going to be comparatively poor. We're not going to be a region that anyone will say, oh, I want to be poor like them. And we're not going to have most of the production of the world happening in the EU. We're just going to be buying it from China and Vietnam and elsewhere instead. So basically outsourcing a lot of our emissions to other places. But most places are going to say, we can't afford, we want to get rich. We're not going to go mostly with renewables. They will go somewhat with renewables. Remember, renewables is great if you live in a hot country where you need air conditioning in the middle of the day when the sun is shining, because that's exactly when you have, your solar panels work. That's great to, cut that extra bulge of energy that you need and get it very cheap. I can see a lot of countries doing that. I can also see a lot of countries doing a little bit, so 5-10% you can get away with, and then they'll do a little bit to get the rich world off their back, as for instance, China has done. People love to look at China and say, "Oh, look at green China," and everything in China is very, very big. So sure, they have lots of wind turbines and lots of solar panels, but just remember, they still get about 89% of their energy from fossil fuels. This is, they were much, much greener back in 1970. Why? Oh, because they were incredibly poor. They got 40% of their energy back then from renewables. Now they get 11%. The reason is, once you get rich, you actually need, as you said, both affordable and reliable power. And so most of the world is going to be run on fossil fuels, even by mid-century, according to the International Energy, unless we come up with a great innovation. If we get fourth generation fission going, or if we get fusion going, who knows? If we get some other innovation, I love to point out Craig Venter, the guy who cracked the human genome back in 2000. He has this idea that we grow genetically modified algae on the ocean surface. And these algae are genetically modified to basically soak up sunlight and CO2 and produce oil. So we could basically we could grow Saudi Arabias all over the ocean, and we would just harvest them, and it would all be CO2 neutral because they just soaked up the CO2 that we'll then burn in our cars. Fundamentally, his point is, if this could be pulled off, we could keep our entire infrastructure and get all of the oil for zero CO2. Now, this is not plausible right now. I mean, we can do it technically, but it's just nowhere near cost effective. But imagine if we could. The point here is to say we need 1,000 ideas like that, and then 999 of those ideas are going to fail, and that's fine. That's how innovation goes. But if one idea comes through, if Craig Venter's idea comes through, he'll be the richest man in the universe, and all good to him, because we'll all be able to have cheaper energy and run it CO2 free. How cool would that be? That's how you deal with these issues, not through telling people you can't do it. You do it with innovation.
Yeah, exactly. And not with fear-mongering the whole time and propaganda. So, because, for example, if you switch on the TV or the telly in Germany or wherever, it's always about this apocalyptic scenes like, hey, the world will end, we're all gonna die. And if you're critical against it, then you're, of course, immediately a conspiracy theorist. So what do you think? How can we, especially the younger generation, reach to end or not fall for this apocalyptic thinking and be more open-minded and look for solution and think positive for the future and get kids again and create and innovate?
Again, if I had that easy solution, we would be in a very different path. I think this is one of the big problems of humanity, that we love these bad stories. We're sort of genetic. If you look back on the world, we are the guys who were worried about saber-toothed tigers, right? We're the descendants of those guys who worried, because the guys who said, you know what, those saber-toothed tigers, it'll probably be fine. They're the ones who died out and never got to, get kids. So in some sense, it made sense when we were really, undeveloped. It made sense to be worried about everything and say behind every corner might be something really bad hiding. And that's still true in a sense. We should be incredibly happy that there are lots and lots of researchers out there telling us about all the things that could go wrong. We should just stop believing that they will all be right, because that's not what our history has shown. 200 years ago, when we had much the same conversation in England, they'd just gotten going with the Industrial Revolution, and then people started increasingly saying, my God, we're all going to run out of coal. I mean, Jevons, who's well known, actually predicted that England would run out of coal. And there was a lot of worry that all of this would fall apart. And, I can see that. It made some sense back then. And there was a lot of other things, we're not doing our schools well enough. We're not doing our production. What are we going to do with all the colonies? There's an infinite number of things that could go wrong. And there's this one clergyman who's very well known for this one quote, but which was basically, how extraordinary. When I look back, all I see is progress. But I'm being told that all I can see in the future is decline. That doesn't quite make sense. And I think we need to get kids and everyone to realize when all we've seen, remember, in 1900, the average age, the life expectancy on the planet was about 32 years. Last year, it was 73. It would have been 74 had it not been for COVID. Right? So fundamentally, we have got twice as much life. Each one of us have gotten 2 lifetimes instead of 1. How amazing is that? And this is just one. Obviously, life really does matter, but it also is reflected in the opportunities that we have. We're better educated. We've gone from a world where almost nobody could read to almost everyone can read, although we still have problems with comprehension, as we talked about. There's so many different things that are mostly on the up. And again, as we talk about air pollution in Germany, dramatically down. So we have good air pollution data. I would love to share that slide with you and your readers. This is
you
the
can
kind of
send
stuff
me.
I will send you, and then we'll show you. So basically, what you see here, we have good data from 1585 in London, and what air pollution was pretty bad already then, and then it just went up and up and up, and got worse and worse and worse until about 1890. 1890 is the point where you start getting cleaner energy sources like coal. Now, we think of coal as really dirty, and it was, but it was a lot cleaner than many of these other energy sources, and you started to have higher smokestacks, which meant that you were distributing over a wider area, and then eventually people also started to become more environmentally concerned. And so what happened here was basically you saw this incredible decline, and today, air pollution in London is cleaner. Sorry, the air in London is cleaner than it's ever been since medieval times, and by a large margin. And the important thing is we should do even more, because air pollution is really, really bad. So we can make it even cleaner, and we know how to do it, and we should certainly do that. But we also need to understand it is not a world where things are getting out of hand and things are getting worse and worse. It's a world where mostly things are getting better and better. Just let me give you one more example on food. When people talk about climate change, what you have to remember is climate change, all things equal, will probably mean more problems for agriculture. Basically because when all the temperature zones shift slightly, you will have to start growing new stuff, or you will have to have at least modified seeds, and many of these will probably perform slightly less well than you'd otherwise have had. So we will actually have a cost. That's part of that 4% cost we talked about very early on. But it's not, we're all going to starve. What the indications are, the biggest meta study on this from Nature magazine, again, one of those studies that pretty much everyone would accept, indicates that we will see hunger decline slightly less than it otherwise would. So right now we have about, 800, 900 million people that are not starving, but that are food insecure is how we define it now. That number will probably be down to about 400 million by mid-century. And because of climate change, it'll probably be somewhere between 5 and 10% higher than that. So yes, we will see a slightly less decline, And that is a problem, but it's not a world where we're all going to starve. It's a world where many fewer people are going to starve, but because of global warming, slightly fewer are not going to be starving. Yes, that's a problem, but we still need to recognize it's a much better world. But it's a world which we can make even better if we do the right decisions. That's the conversation we need to get back with. But honestly, I've just spent, 3 minutes or 5 minutes explaining this, and that's the answer to why we can't get this through. It's just much easier to say, we're all going to die because of global warming, than having this long conversation and telling you why that's not the reality.
I agree with you in actually nearly all the points, because I think innovation, capitalism, humanity will survive. We will find solutions like we always did. I'm ultra bullish actually on mankind. And we should think positive for the future and not like getting scared and run away and think, oh, it's over and everything. So that's why I have to say I agree with you 100%. So Bjørn, thank you very much for your time. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you. And my last question has nothing to do with climate change or energy. It's something totally different. And it's perhaps a question that the audience can know you better. So what is the meaning of life for Bjørn Lomborg?
Gotcha. So just a very quick, short question at the end of this talk. So I think, so let me just separate it out first. I think meaning of life is really only something that you can start talking about when your kids are not dying tonight, or you have enough food and you have education. So a very large part of our job as humanity is to make sure that everybody else gets to ask that question. And it's a very, very privileged question, which, honestly, we've only had, most of us have never had that conversation at 200 years ago. So it just shows you how well off we are. Now, what's my meaning of life? It's partly, I'm an academic, I'm a geek. I love learning stuff for no good reason. So I enjoy doing Excel sheets and finding out stuff that I didn't know before, even if it has no practical meaning, or it doesn't really improve the conversations that I would have with you or anything else. I think that a lot of things are interesting, so I'm very intellectually curious. I think it's also very, very much about doing what you love. So I love, playing PlayStation. I play the piano. I love little things that move. So actually, here I have a little gizmo that draws pictures in the sand with a little ball. Yeah, I love that kind of thing.
I know that one. It's beautiful.
It's just this absurd little obsession with sort of fun things that you wouldn't have thought of right off the bat. And then, of course, I think doing good in the world. But that sounds very sort of, I also wanted, it sounds a little bit like the American pageants and world peace. But the reality is this, we should be aware of how incredibly fortunate we are. And I think we often don't. Pretty much everyone who's ever going to watch this video is in the top 1% of the income distribution of the world.
Yeah,
that's worth considering, right?
Yeah,
even if you're
we should all be grateful. Every day we should pray and say thank you for this privilege, living in this time.
And I think that also tells us that that one of the things we have to do is to make sure that we don't forget the poorest half of the world, which is the one that I was talking about earlier with the Sustainable Development Goals. About 4.1 billion people live in the low and lower middle income countries, which is basically the poorest of the poor. They have less than $12 a day. You probably, I don't know but the average person in the rich countries have $133. So we're just much better off, and we've stopped thinking about this, and so we very often sort of impose our qualities of life on them, and we say, your conversations should be very much about, we should all be accepting, and we should have Paralympics, and we should have, all these, we should have combined, toilets and all these things. And there's nothing wrong with that conversation in the rich world, but there's just a couple of other things that are more important. And obviously the biggest sort of wasteful conversation, I think, is the way that we think of climate change as the ultimate way of showing we're good people and we want to do good in the world. Whereas for most people, that would probably be making sure that their kids learn well in school, that they stop dying, they stop going hungry. So, the world is not that complicated. And so the meaning for me is not only just having fun and enjoying myself and having fun gizmos as this one, but it's also very, very much about caring about people. Now, obviously, this is also on a personal level. Have good friends, enjoy your friends, make sure that you care about the people who are close to you. And all this sounds a little sort of banal, but it is true. But I think it's also our sort of more general, we have a commitment to the rest of the world, and we often fail to do that because we're so, wound up in our own little headspace.
Yeah, beautiful. But you do your part definitely with your books and, this is my book,
That's
sorry.
not my book, although I hear it's a good book.
with your book and everything, and with this conversation, of course. And I'm really curious what you think about this interview with Bjørn. Please leave a comment, and if you like the content, share it, and definitely leave a subscription here for my channel. Bjørn, thank you very much. It was great talking to you, and I really, really hope we do this again with a new book, or just if you have something in mind, or climate change will definitely be part of the future. So we have a lot to talk about, and it was great talking to you, and perhaps next time in Sweden, who knows?
Absolutely. Let's do that, Mark. Thank you.